In the autumn of 1987, I sat in front of an old tape recorder in the small room behind the house. My hands had begun to tremble. Old age slows a person down, but strangely memory does not. Some nights I still wake with start, hearing the sound of iron chains dragging across wet pavement. Some mornings I open the door to the yard, see golden sunlight on the grass, and my chest aches remembering a different white, the snow of the Ardennes, where so many of my friends remain forever. I press play. The tape hissed and whirred. I cleared my throat and looked at the black and white photograph on the table. And it were 4 young men in U.S. Army uniforms, shoulders touching, smiling as though war could never reach them. But war reaches everyone. My name is Daniel Hayes. I said slowly into the microphone. If one day you hear this tape, Caleb, please remember, I did not record it to talk about myself. I recorded it to talk about the men who wore the American uniform and walked into fire without turning away. I paused for a few seconds. Outside the window, the American flag in front of the porch swayed gently in the breeze. I closed my eyes and returned to 1944. I was 23 then. I lived in Abilene, Kansas. Our home had a wheat field, a small horse barn, and an old radio on the kitchen shelf. So old that every time it turned on it crackled like someone whispering from very far away. That evening my father sat listening to the war news. My mother was mending a shirt. My wife, Grace, stood by the window, one hand resting on her belly. She was 5 months pregnant. I still remember the soft yellow lamplight falling across her face, tender to the point of pain. The broadcaster's voice came through the radio, low and grave, speaking of the European front, of villages crushed, of families vanishing in the night. My father was silent a long time. Then he switched the radio off. The kitchen became so quiet I could hear the wall clock ticking. He looked at me. "You know you're going," he said. Not a question. A truth already present in the room before anyone spoke. I looked at Grace. She did not cry. She only pressed her lips together, as if trying to hold her heart still. "I don't want to go," I confessed. It was the first time in my life I spoke my fear out loud. "I don't want to leave her. I don't want to leave the child." My father nodded. No decent man wants war. He stood slowly, walked over, and placed his calloused hand on my shoulder. "Daniel, listen to me. What makes the American Army strong is not only guns, tanks, or flags. It is the men who are still afraid, yet still go, who still stand in front of evil so others can live in peace." My mother bowed her head and quietly wiped her eyes. Grace stepped closer. She took my hand. Her palm was warm and soft, while mine felt like ice. "I don't want you to go," she said, voice thin as thread. "But I want our child to grow up one day in a country where it never has to bow to fear." I looked at the woman I loved, and in that moment I understood that courage is not always in the one holding the rifle. Sometimes courage is a woman standing at the door, accepting her husband's departure because she believes in what is right. The next morning I went to the recruitment office. The small town had wind that day. Yellow leaves swirled along the dirt road. Young men stood in line, each trying to look tougher than the worry in his eyes. When I signed the enlistment paper, my hand shook slightly. No one laughed, because everyone was shaking. The night before I left, Grace gave me a small pocket Bible and a photograph of us standing in front of the porch. "So you remember someone is waiting." I smiled weakly. "I'm afraid one day I'll forget what home feels like." She placed her hand on my chest. "Then don't let the war take your heart." I held her for a very long time. Her hair smelled of cheap soap and sunshine, an ordinary scent that, years later in a military hospital, I could still recall. Before I boarded the train, my father pressed his pocket watch into my hand. "I carried this back from the Great War." I looked at the scratched face. He continued, voice slow and firm. "If you must fight, fight like a real American." I looked up. He met my eyes. Not the best at destruction, but the best at protection. The train whistle blew. My mother began to cry. Grace did not. She simply stood there, hands cradling her belly, wind lifting the hem of her pale green dress, looking at me as though trying to carve my face into her heart. I climbed aboard. As the train began to move, I leaned out the window. Grace called after me. "Daniel, I'm here. Come back." I nodded. At that moment, I did not yet know that some promises are kept with footsteps, and some must be kept with an entire lifetime. The training camp in Georgia was scorching. Sweat ran in streams under our collars. Red clay stuck to our boots. Every day began with a bugle and ended with the panting of exhausted bodies, still forced to stand straight. There I met Thomas Reed. He came from Tennessee. Tall, dark blonde hair, a crooked smile that made it seem life had never taught him fear. But I knew he was afraid too. He just hid it behind jokes. "Hayes," Thomas said while stuffing his shirt into his pack. "If we die on the drill field tomorrow because of that drill sergeant, at least they'll say we died standing very straight." I laughed. "You die alone then. I still have to go home." Thomas glanced at the photo of Grace I kept in my pack. "Oh, right. The married man with a beautiful wife and a baby on the way." "Shut up." "No. You should know jealousy is a powerful spiritual force for a soldier." And so we became friends. Besides Thomas, my unit included Paul Bennett, a young medic from Ohio, Frank Donnelly, a grizzled sergeant whose voice always sounded like an order, and Lieutenant Samuel Carter, our young commander whose eyes looked older than his years. Carter was a kind of officer who did not need to shout to prove strength. He simply stood there, back straight, calm, and everyone quieted naturally. On the first day of rifle practice, my shoulder bruised from the recoil. Thomas laughed until he choked. Family love makes you pull the trigger like an old lady. I shoved his shoulder. "Laugh again and I tell the whole platoon about the 3 letters you wrote, but never send to Margaret." Thomas flushed. "Keep your mouth shut." I was surprised. "So it's true?" "Yeah," he muttered. "We're engaged." I looked at him. For the first time in weeks the usual joking faded, replaced by something deeper. "Does she know you're scared?" Thomas was quiet a moment, then nodded. "Yes, and she still loves me." I remembered that sentence for a very long time, because war strips people bare. It reveals cowardice, selfishness, brutality, but it also reveals the most beautiful things. And real love does not demand that a person feel no fear. It only asks that they do not run from what is right. The weeks of training continued. We crawled through mud, ran under barbed wire, learned to dress wounds in darkness, learned to obey orders while ears still rang from explosions, learned to fall and stand again even when knees felt shattered. One blistering afternoon, after an exhausting march, Donnelly gathered platoon under the fierce sun. He walked past each man, eyes cutting like a blade, then stopped in front of us. "What do you think the Army is?" No one answered. He nodded as though he expected it. "Let me tell you, the Army is not a place for lone heroes. The American Army exists because the man on your right dares to pull the man on your left back up, because you eat the last spoonful of your ration, but are still willing to break it in half for your buddy, because when bullets fly, you think of the mission and the man beside you before yourself." He pointed straight at our chests. "You can shoot well, run fast, be stronger than the next guy, but if you don't know how to keep the man next to you alive, you don't deserve that uniform." That afternoon, we sat behind the wooden barracks, sharing a cigarette and a can of coffee. No one joked. Donnelly's words still echoed in every head. Paul, the quiet medic, spoke first. "I hate blood." Thomas smirked. "And yet you became a medic?" Paul stared out at the training field. "That's exactly why. Someone has to hate it enough to try to stop it from flowing more." The air grew still. I looked at Paul, then Thomas, then at the long, silent rows of barracks in the late sun. I realized the American Army did not gather only men who wanted to win. It gathered men who did not want evil to win. Those are 2 entirely different things. That night I wrote to Grace. I told her about the heat, about noisy Thomas, about kind Paul, about new boots that blistered both feet. I did not tell her that every night I missed her until my chest hurt. I did not tell her that sometimes, when the midnight bugle screamed, I lay staring at the ceiling wondering if I had enough courage for what was coming. Instead I wrote, "I am learning to be a good soldier, not to be famous, only so that if one day someone needs me to stand in front of them, I will not step back. A few days later, Grace's reply arrived. The envelope was thin, handwriting soft. I opened it with hands filthy from red clay. Dear Daniel, our baby kicks harder every week. I think it's hot-tempered like you. I still stand on the porch every evening looking toward the train tracks. Not because I'm weak, only because I want my heart to remember that waiting is also a way of loving. I had to stop reading there. My eyes stung. Thomas saw, but did not tease. He only said quietly, "Go home, Daniel, even if you have to walk through hell." I folded the letter, tucked it into my breast pocket, right over my heart. Many years later, people may forget the name of a battle, forget the position of a bridge, forget the exact number of a campaign. But stories like this should not be forgotten, because history is not written only with maps and orders. It is also written with the hand of an American soldier placed on the shoulder of a trembling child, with a piece of chocolate broken in half on a freezing night, with a comrade's name called through gunfire, with a letter kept intact from battlefield to hometown, with the promise of men who knew they might not survive, yet stepped forward anyway. And perhaps that is what is most worth praising. Not war, but humanity still standing upright inside war. Not the sound of guns, but hearts that refuse to let guns make them cruel. Not destruction, but the strength to protect. If I had to say briefly what the American Army is in this story, the answer would be, it is men who know pain, no longing, no fear, no love. But when needed, they still stand up to preserve freedom, shield comrades, shelter civilians, and carry the honor of their flag to the very last moment. And as long as someone still tells these stories, those who fell will never truly disappear. We left America on a gray morning. The troop ship pulled heavily away from the dock. I stood at the railing, watching the shore recede, watching the stars and stripes flag flutter in the sea wind. No one spoke loudly. The air on deck was thick with a silence. Everyone understood, but no one named. Fear, down in the cramped hold. The smells of oil, sweat, metal, and seawater mixed until it was hard to breathe. Some men were seasick. Some pretended to sleep. Some sat writing letters, as if writing fast and long enough could shorten the distance between them and home. Thomas lay in the hammock above me, swaying with the ship's motion. What kind of soldier do you think you'll be? I didn't look up. The kind that stays alive. He gave a small laugh, realistic. And you? Thomas was quiet a few seconds. The kind that doesn't leave his buddies behind. I turned to look at him. In the dim yellow light, the usual joking had left his face. Only quiet determination remained. I asked, if you had to choose between the mission and a friend? Thomas drew a deep breath. A soldier is taught to do the mission. But I think sometimes the biggest mission is bringing your own people home. That answer stayed with me through many years. During those days at sea, we were briefed on Europe, on terrain, on recognizing artillery, on ambush situations. We listened, memorized, nodded, but no lecture could fully prepare a man for war. In the evenings, Paul often sat near me, checking his aid bag again. Every roll of bandage, every vial of morphine, with the careful attention of a priest preparing for chapel. I always thought medics were the bravest. I said. Paul shrugged. No, just the ones with no other choice. Meaning when someone falls, you either run to them or live the rest of your life knowing you were a coward. I nodded. That night the waves against the hull sounded like heavy blows from fate. I took Grace's photo out and looked at it under the faint light. Then I wrote another letter. Dear Grace, if you find this letter too sad, forgive me. Some nights at sea, I realize I never understood the value of ordinary things until I had to leave them. I miss the sound of wooden chairs scraping on the kitchen floor. I miss the smell of Mother's baking. I even miss you scolding me for hanging my coat in the wrong place. I miss all the little things I used to think were unimportant. I stopped writing, swallow hard. I think that's what war teaches. That home isn't just a flag. It's the small things you're terrified of losing. And maybe that's why American soldiers like us set out. I folded the letter, tucked inside my shirt, like a talisman. One morning the ship shuddered with an alert. Word of an enemy submarine somewhere off our course sent tension rippling across the deck. Everyone was ordered into life jackets. No one joked anymore. A young soldier in the corner began praying aloud. Another pulled his wedding ring from his pocket, kissed it quickly, and tucked it back. I looked at those faces and thought, this is the American Army, not a faceless steel machine, but thousands of hearts pounding with homesickness, fear, hope, and still moving forward. Fortunately, the ship was not attacked. But after that, the boyish air in us was gone. We grew quieter, older, and closer to one another. The night before we sighted Europe, Carter walked the length of the hold, stopping at each group. He didn't speak flowery words. He simply stood, eyes on each man. When you step onto land, you will no longer be men fighting only for yourselves. Remember you were the flag of the United States on your shoulders. But that flag means nothing if you forget humanity. He paused in front of Paul. Bennett, you keep them alive. Then to Thomas. Reed, you keep their spirits. Finally, he looked at me. Hayes, you keep your promise. I faltered slightly. Sir. Carter glanced at the corner of Grace's photo peeking from my breast pocket. Any man who carries a family photo close to his heart is living by a promise. I didn't know what to say. I only nodded faintly. The next morning, when the hazy coastline appeared to mist, I felt as though I was stepping through a door that, once crossed, would never let me be the old Daniel again. We entered France not long after the big landings. Not on the first historic day, but early enough that the ground was still full of bomb craters, charred walls, and the thick smell of war you could almost taste. If you've never walked through a village freshly torn by war, you won't understand how frightening its silence is. Not the explosions, but the absence of normal sounds. No children laughing, no windows opening, no spoons touching bowls, only wind whistling through roofless houses, and the sound of army boots crunching on broken brick. Our unit's first mission was to sweep a stretch of rural road and hold a key crossroads. Donnelly led. Thomas, Paul, and I followed close. The first time I heard bullets whistle overhead, my whole body froze. I'm not ashamed to say it. Anyone who claims their first time under fire wasn't terrifying is either lying or no longer knows what fear is. I pressed myself into the ditch, face in the mud, heart pounding so hard it hurt. Donnelly's voice roared, "Move! Move, damn it!" Thomas crawled close. Daniel. I turned. His face was mud-streaked, eyes wide with strain. "You still with me?" I nodded hard. "Then move." That moment saved me from being swallowed by fear, not sudden bravery, but because someone called my name in the middle of hell. I inched forward, fired back, advanced a few yards. Then a weak cry came from a half-collapsed house on the right. Paul heard it first. "Civilians!" Donnelly growled. "Ignore it! Hold formation." But the cry came again. Small, thin, desperate. I don't know what I was thinking when I stood and ran toward that house. Maybe I was stupid. Maybe I was too human. But I knew one thing for certain. If the American Army was here and still ignored that cry, then everything we'd been taught about protecting the weak would become meaningless. Thomas cursed and followed me. We rolled behind a fallen wall. Inside was a dead French woman and a boy about 6 years old trapped under a beam. The boy wasn't screaming, just gasping, eyes wide with shock. "Paul." I yelled. Paul ran in as though bullets didn't exist. I'll never forget the image. An American medic kneeling in a ruined house, hands shaking but movements precise, slipping bandages under bleeding spots, stroking the head of a boy who spoke no English, shared no flag, yet was saved as if he were his own flesh and blood. Thomas lifted the beam. I pulled the boy free. When I held him and ran back to safety, I could feel his small heart hammering against my chest. Light, but alive. After that fight, we held the crossroads. That afternoon, an old woman from the last cellar in the village came out, trembling, took my hand, and kissed the back of my filthy knuckles. She said something in French. I didn't understand, but her tears told me enough. That night, Carter sat with us beside a broken fence. He lit a cigarette. No one spoke first. Finally, he looked at me. "You broke formation." "I know, sir. You could have died." "I know." He was silent a moment, then nodded very slightly. "But you brought the boy out." I looked up. He gazed far off toward the village we had held. The American army is remembered not only for victories, but for the lives it refused to turn its back on. That night I couldn't sleep. I sat against a broken brick wall, opened my notebook, and wrote to Grace. Today I understood more clearly why I'm here. Not to hate people, but to stop people from being crushed by those who have lost all humanity. I looked up at the European night sky, where no star was bright enough to erase the smell of smoke, then added, if our daughter ever asks what war is, I'll tell her it's the place where evil tries to force good to be silent. And I hope she knows that a real American soldier doesn't carry a rifle to destroy, but so children like that boy today still have a chance to grow up. I folded the letter. In the dark, Thomas sat down beside me, said nothing, just handed me the last piece of chocolate. I laughed. You'll starve yourself? Thomas shrugged. Sure, Donnelly said it already. No one deserves a uniform if he won't break his share in half. I broke the chocolate. Each of us half. In a village reeking of smoke, that was the sweetest thing I ever tasted. We left America on a gray morning. The troop ship pulled heavily away from the dock. I stood at the railing, watching the shore recede, watching the Stars and Stripes flag flutter in the sea wind. No one spoke loudly. The air on deck was thick with a silence everyone understood, but no one named. Fear, down in the cramp hold. The smells of oil, sweat, metal, and seawater mixed until it was hard to breathe. Some men were seasick. Some pretended to sleep. Some sat writing letters, as if writing fast and long enough could shorten the distance between them and home. Thomas lay in a hammock above me, swaying with the ship's motion. What kind of soldier do you think you'll be? I didn't look up. The kind that stays alive? He gave a small laugh. Realistic. And you? Thomas was quiet a few seconds. The kind that doesn't leave his buddies behind. I turned to look at him. In the dim yellow light, the usual joking had left his face. Only quiet determination remained. I asked, if you had to choose between the mission and a friend? Thomas drew a deep breath. A soldier is taught to do the mission. But I think sometimes the biggest mission is bringing your own people home. That answer stayed with me through many years. During those days at sea, we were briefed on Europe, on terrain, on recognizing artillery, on ambush situations. We listened, memorized, nodded, but no lecture could fully prepare a man for war. In the evenings, Paul often sat near me, checking his aid bag again. Every roll of bandage, every vial of morphine, with the careful attention of a priest preparing for chapel. I always thought medics were the bravest. I said. Paul shrugged. No, just the ones with no other choice. Meaning when someone falls, you either run to them or live the rest of your life knowing you were a coward. I nodded. That night the waves against the hull sounded like heavy blows from fate. I took Grace's photo out and looked at it under the faint light. Then I wrote another letter. Dear Grace, if you find this letter too sad, forgive me. Some nights at sea I realized I never understood the value of ordinary things until I had to leave them. I missed the sound of wooden chairs scraping on the kitchen floor. I missed the smell of Mother's baking. I even miss you scolding me for hanging my coat in the wrong place. I miss all the little things I used to think were unimportant. I stopped writing, swallowed hard. I think that's what war teaches. That home isn't just a flag. It's the small things you're terrified of losing. And maybe that's why American soldiers like us set out. I folded the letter, tucked it inside my shirt, like a talisman. One morning the ship shuddered with an alert. Word of an enemy submarine somewhere off our course sent tension rippling across the deck. Everyone was ordered into life jackets. No one joked anymore. A young soldier in the corner began praying aloud. Another pulled his wedding ring from his pocket, kissed it quickly, and tucked it back. I looked at those faces and thought, this is the American Army, not a faceless steel machine, but thousands of hearts pounding with homesickness, fear, hope, and still moving forward. Fortunately, the ship was not attacked, but after that, the boyish air in us was gone. We grew quieter, older, and closer to one another. The night before we sighted Europe, Carter walked the length of the hold, stopping at each group. He didn't speak flowery words. He simply stood, eyes on each man. When you step onto land, You will no longer be men fighting only for yourselves. Remember you wear the flag of the United States on your shoulders. But that flag means nothing if you forget humanity. He paused in front of Paul. Bennett, you keep them alive. Then to Thomas. Reed, you keep their spirits. Finally he looked at me. Hayes, you keep your promise. I faltered slightly. Sir. Carter glanced at the corner of Grace's photo peeking from my breast pocket. Any man who carries a family photo close to his heart is living by a promise. I didn't know what to say. I only nodded faintly. The next morning, when the hazy coastline appeared to mist, I felt as though I was stepping through a door that, once crossed, would never let me be the old Daniel again. We entered France not long after the big landings. Not on the first historic day, but early enough that the ground was still full of bomb craters, charred walls, and the thick smell of war you could almost taste. If you've never walked through a village freshly torn by war, you won't understand how frightening its silence is. Not the explosions, but the absence of normal sounds. No children laughing, no windows opening, no spoons touching bowls, only wind whistling through roofless houses, and the sound of army boots crunching on broken brick. Our unit's first mission was to sweep a stretch of rural road and hold a key crossroads. Donnelly led, Thomas, Paul, and I followed close. The first time I heard bullets whistle overhead, my whole body froze. I'm not ashamed to say it. Anyone who claims their first time under fire wasn't terrifying is either lying or no longer knows what fear is. I pressed myself into the ditch, face in the mud, heart pounding so hard it hurt. Donnelly's voice roared, Move! Move, damn it! Thomas crawled close. Daniel. I turned. His face was mud-streaked, eyes wide with strain. You still with me? I nodded hard. Then move. That moment saved me from being swallowed by fear. Not sudden bravery, but because someone called my name in the middle of hell. I inched forward, fired back, advanced a few yards. Then a weak cry came from the half-collapsed house on the right. Paul heard it first. Civilians! Donnelly growled. Ignore it. Hold formation. But the cry came again. Small, thin, desperate. I don't know what I was thinking when I stood and ran toward that house. Maybe I was stupid. Maybe I was too human. But I knew one thing for certain. If the American army was here and still ignored that cry, then everything we've been taught about protecting the weak would become meaningless. Thomas cursed and followed me. We rolled behind a fallen wall. Inside was a dead French woman and a boy about 6 years old trapped under a beam. The boy wasn't screaming, just gasping, eyes wide with shock. Paul! I yelled. Paul ran in as though bullets didn't exist. I'll never forget the image. An American medic kneeling in a ruined house, hands shaking but movements precise, slipping bandages under bleeding spots, stroking the head of a boy who spoke no English, shared no flag, yet was saved as if he were his own flesh and blood. Thomas lifted the beam. I pulled the boy free. When I held him and ran back to safety, I could feel his small heart hammering against my chest. Light, but alive. After that fight, we held the crossroads. That afternoon, an old woman from the last cellar in the village came out, trembling, took my hand, and kissed the back of my filthy knuckles. She said something in French. I didn't understand, but her tears told me enough. That night Carter sat with us beside a broken fence. He lit a cigarette. No one spoke first. Finally, he looked at me. You broke formation. I know, sir. You could have died. I know. He was silent a moment, then nodded very slightly. But you brought the boy out. I looked up. He gazed far off toward the village we had held. The American army is remembered not only for victories, but for the lives it refused to turn its back on. That night, I couldn't sleep. I sat against a broken brick wall, opened my notebook, and wrote to Grace. Today I understood more clearly why I'm here. Not to hate people, but to stop people from being crushed by those who have lost all humanity. I looked up at the European night sky, where no star was bright enough to erase the smell of smoke, then added, if our daughter ever asks what war is, I'll tell her it's a place where evil tries to force good to be silent. And I hope she knows that a real American soldier doesn't carry a rifle to destroy, but so children like that boy today still have a chance to grow up. I folded the letter. In the dark, Thomas sat down beside me, said nothing, just handed me the last piece of chocolate. I laughed. You'll starve yourself? Thomas shrugged. Share it. Donnelly said it already. No one deserves a uniform if he won't break his share in half. I broke the chocolate. Each of us half. In a village reeking of smoke. That was the sweetest thing I ever tasted. The morning after that Christmas Eve, new orders arrived. A recon platoon ahead had lost contact near a vital bridge. If the bridge fell to the enemy, hundreds of civilians and a supply convoy behind us would be trapped. Carter selected a small group, me, Thomas, Paul, Donnelly, and 3 others. No one was happy about the assignment. Snow was knee-deep, visibility poor. Every step felt like treading into a white trap with unknown dangers beneath. We set out before full light. The world had only 3 colors: white snow, gray sky, black skeletal trees. After more than an hour, we spotted blood trails in the snow. Donnelly signaled halt. Everyone held their breath. Paul knelt, touched the frozen red. Fresh. We followed the tracks to an old anti-tank ditch. There were 2 American soldiers, still alive, one with a leg wound, the other barely conscious from cold and blood loss. When they saw our patches, the wounded man started crying, not from pain, from finally seeing his own people. That is something only a soldier truly understands. In war, sometimes the greatest hope in the world is simply seeing the same uniform color coming toward you. Paul began first aid immediately. Thomas and I kept watch toward the woods. Donnelly leaned close to the wounded man. Where are the rest? The soldier swallowed hard. Near the bridge, Lieutenant Martin is holding, but they're being pushed back. Carter didn't wait. We move on. What about them? I asked. Bennett stays with 1. The other 2 carry the 3rd halfway back, then return. Thomas shook his head. We won't make it in time. Donnelly stared through the snow toward the faint bridge. If Lieutenant Martin fell, it wasn't just 1 unit lost. The entire rear line would be exposed. Carter decided instantly. All advance. No one left behind, but no one abandons the mission. Short, clear, the kind of decision that makes men follow an officer to the end. Paul tightened his aid bag strap. Then I'll drag the wounded one. You can't, I said. Thomas was already kneeling by the unconscious soldier. I'll carry him. He bent low. The man was too weak to hold on properly, but Thomas still heaved him onto his back. The sight in that white snow was unforgettable, not because it was grand, but because it was so simple. A young American soldier, lips blue from cold, boots sinking deep, carrying a heavy comrade forward. That, in the end, is much of what military glory really looks like. The bridge appeared when we were still a few hundred yards away. Gunfire echoed. Sporadic, fading. We hurried. When we reached it, the scene cut into my mind like a wound. A burning jeep, 2 bodies motionless behind sandbags. Lieutenant Martin, wounded in the shoulder, but still directing the few survivors holding the bridgehead. Carter, he rasped. Thank God. We poured into position. I fired until my shoulder went numb. Thomas set his burden down safely and grabbed another rifle. Paul rolled through snow and mud to Martin. Donnelly became living rock, calmly issuing orders, reloading, holding angles. In one fleeting moment amid the bullets, I realized something I would tell my grandchildren for the rest of my life. American soldiers are strong not because they feel no pain, but because they still do what must be done while in the worst pain. After nearly an hour of fierce fighting, the enemy pulled back temporarily. No cheering. No one had the strength. We just looked at each other, breathing hard in clouds of frost. Martin clutched his shoulder, looked at Carter. If you'd been 10 minutes later, Carter cut him off. But we were here. I looked at the exhausted faces around me. Yes, we were here. And in war, sometimes a unit of Americans arriving at the right moment means an entire village behind them gets to live one more day. That night was the coldest I ever endured. We held the bridge with thin forces and limited ammunition, waiting for reinforcements. Snow fell heavier. Wind sliced through wool. through uniform straight into flesh. One young soldier from Martin's group developed fever and delirium. He kept calling for his mother. Paul stayed beside him all night, applying what little warm water we had, piling on extra coats, checking breathing as if we were still in a peaceful hospital instead of the edge of a battlefield. I whispered, "Paul, you need rest too." He shook his head. "If he dies of cold while I can still sit here, I won't forgive myself." I turned away, not because I didn't want to see, but because sometimes another man's kindness hurts so much you don't know how to respond. Near midnight, we heard a faint cry from below the embankment at the bridgehead. Donnelly raised a hand for silence. The cry came again, clearer, one of ours, but the position was outside our cover. Easy prey for any sniper still lurking in the dark. Carter shook his head. Too dangerous. No one argued. We all knew it was true. Then the moan rose again, thin, broken, like life making one last plea. Thomas set his rifle down. "I'm going." "Absolutely not," Carter growled. "Sir, that's one of ours." "I know." "Then I'm going." Carter clenched his jaw. "Read." But Thomas had already turned to me, pressing a small chain with Margaret's name tag into my hand. "If I don't come back—" "Shut up. Daniel, listen." I gripped his wrist. "We go together." Carter looked at us both. 1 second. 2. Then, through gritted teeth. 30 seconds. No more. Thomas, and I crawled down the embankment in darkness. Snow burned through knees. I could hear my heartbeat in my ears. The wounded soldier lay pinned under a wrecked truck wheel, his legs soaked in blood. Thomas knelt first. "It's me, U.S. Army. Can you hear me?" The man opened his eyes. "Thought you left me?" Thomas leaned closer. "Never happens." We strained to lift the wheel. Heavy as hell. Muscles felt like they would tear. Finally, it shifted enough. Thomas slid under and pulled the man free. At that instant, a shot tore the night. Bullet struck snow inches away. "Run!" I yelled. Thomas slung the man over his shoulder. I supported the other side. 3 bodies staggered up the slope. More shots followed. One grazed my helmet. When we tumbled behind the sandbags, the men above laid down fierce, covering fire. Paul dragged the wounded man inside at once. Carter looked at Thomas. He didn't yell, didn't praise, just said one sentence, low and heavy. "Read." That was an enormous risk. Thomas panted. "I know, sir." Carter looked at the rescued soldier, then at the whole group. If anyone asks why people trust the American Army, this is the answer. No one spoke, but in every eye saw the same thing. Pride, not loud pride, quiet, deep, burning like buried coals. That we serve in an army taught never to leave its own behind. A few hours later, reinforcements finally arrived. The bridge was held. Villagers evacuated safely. When the first pale dawn light tinted the snow blue, I collapsed against the ground, too spent to stand. Thomas sat beside me, lips cracked, hands shaking from cold, but he still smiled. "See? Told you. Only cowards leave their own." I laughed weakly. "You're crazy." Thomas tilted his head. "Maybe, but if the American Army is full of men who feel cold, feel fear, yet still run out to drag their brothers back, then I think that isn't madness. That's honor." I looked at the weak sun rising over the bare trees. For the first time in months, my chest held not only exhaustion, but also faith. War went on. Like a tireless machine, it ground through winter, through villages, through the youth of so many. After the bridge, our unit received replacements, but no one ever felt truly refilled. New men brought new voices. The dead left holes no one could fill. Thomas joked less, not because he was constantly sad, but because some things, once seen, take away the ability to be carefree. One rare quiet evening, with no artillery, I found him sitting alone under a leafless tree, writing by shielded flashlight. I approached. "Letter to Margaret?" He folded the paper quickly. "Yeah." I sat beside him. Cold wind whipped our faces. "I'm writing to Grace, too." Thomas gave a thin smile. "Funny, war turned both of us into poets." "What are you writing her?" He was silent a long time. Then, without looking at me, I'm writing that if I don't come back, she shouldn't hate the army. I turned fully toward him. Thomas kept staring into the dark ahead, because I don't want Margaret to think I was taken by something meaningless. I want her to know I served alongside decent men who dared give each other blankets, risked their lives for civilians, carried wounded through snow. If I die, I want her to remember I didn't die alone in the dark. I died in the ranks of an army that knows how to protect its own. I swallowed hard. You'll tell her yourself. Thomas smiled. Daniel, sometimes I think your optimism is downright reckless. And I think your pessimism comes from loving too much. He turned, lightly punched my shoulder. Sounds pretty good, actually. A moment later, Thomas pulled 3 carefully folded envelopes from his pocket. One for Margaret, one for my son when he's old enough to read, and one for you. I froze. For me? Yeah. Why? If I live, you give it back. If I die, you keep it. I didn't take them. Thomas pressed them into my hand. Just take them. I stared at the thin envelopes that suddenly felt heavy as stone. I hate this. Me too. Then why? Thomas looked up at the sky. The wartime night sky held no romance. Cold, distant, cruelly silent. Because an American soldier is taught to prepare for the worst while still fighting for the best. He said it so naturally, like an obvious truth. I tucked the 3 letters into my inner pocket, beside Grace's letters and Emily's photo. In that moment, I had no idea I had just taken on a burden I would carry the rest of my life. The biggest battle of my life began on a morning so gray you couldn't tell clouds from smoke. Our unit was ordered to hold an iron bridge leading into a small riverside town until the last civilians and ambulances crossed. Carter knew what it meant. We all did. Holding meant standing still so others could retreat. Holding meant becoming the wall between life and death. From early morning, people streamed across the bridge. Women, children, elderly, a mother carrying a baby wrapped in gray blanket, an old man pushing a wheelbarrow piled with bedding, a boy leading a bony dog, all moving in silent panic of people who had already seen too much horror. We helped them cross. Thomas carried 2 children at once. Paul guided the lightly wounded. Donnelly barked orders to keep order, but his voice lacked its usual roughness. It was the urgency of a man trying to preserve every life. Near noon, shells began falling. The ground shook. The steel bridge rang with eerie sounds. Smoke and dust blinded everything. Carter shouted, "Hold position." We spread along both ends of the bridge. I fired until the barrel was hot. Across from me, Thomas changed magazines like a machine. Paul darted between positions, ducking bullets while dragging wounded to cover. At one point, I saw him pressing his hand to a comrade's open wound with one hand while pointing escape routes for civilians with the other. That wasn't movie bravery. It was real courage. Quiet, dirty, bloody, extraordinary. When the last ambulance was rolling onto the bridge, a salvo landed near the riverbank. A section of railing collapsed. Smoke swallowed visibility. Screams rose. I heard Thomas yell my name. Daniel. I turned to see a little girl fall in the middle of the bridge, only steps from the broken railing. Her mother had been shoved to the far side, screaming hoarsely. No one could rush out into that firestorm without knowing they might never return. Thomas ran before I could think. He dashed through smoke, bent, scooped the child up. At that moment, a shell exploded close enough that my chest vibrated. Thomas was thrown. The girl flew from his arms, but landed where Donnelly and I could pull her in. Thomas lay still for seconds, then tried to push himself up. I ran to him. Thomas. Blood poured from his side. Fast. Too much. I knelt beside my best friend amid deafening explosions, amid the burning bridge. No. No, no, no. Thomas looked at me, face ashen. Get the civilians across first. I screamed for Paul. Paul crawled over, saw the wound, knew instantly how bad. But he still did everything possible. Pressure bandage, morphine, kept breathing, kept hope, kept the soul from slipping too fast. Thomas gripped my wrist. Weak but fierce. Daniel, I'm here. Listen. Don't talk. The letters. I broke. I know. Tell Margaret I thought of her to the end. I will. And tell the boy. He swallowed with difficulty, eyes looking past me to somewhere War couldn't reach. Tell him his dad was scared, but still did what had to be done. I bowed my head. Tears fell onto his dirt-streaked face. Thomas gave the faintest smile. A good American soldier isn't one who feels no fear. His voice faded, but one who doesn't let fear decide. I squeezed his hand until it hurt. Thomas, look at me. Look at me. He tried to open his eyes one more time. Take me home. Those were his last words. His hand went slack. Amid smoke, amid ringing steel, amid a bridge on fire, I lost my closest friend. But the battle wasn't over. Carter yanked me up almost roughly. Hayes! Hold position. I looked at him, pain in his eyes too, but he wouldn't let us both fall. Reed wanted you to stand up. I don't know where the strength came from to keep going. Perhaps from the pain. Perhaps from the promise. Perhaps from the sacrifice that had just happened before my eyes. We held the bridge another 40 minutes. 40 minutes that felt like a lifetime. When the final withdrawal order came, the bridge was nearly twisted scrap, but every civilian behind us had crossed. Every single one. As we pulled back, I turned once. Through gray smoke and leaden sky, a small American flag painted on the side of an ambulance, splattered with mud, still visible. I stood frozen for a second, and in that tearing pain, I understood why some people would respect the American Army their whole lives. Not because they suffered no loss, but because they accepted loss so others could live. After the bridge, I was knocked out briefly by the concussion of an explosion. When I woke in the field aid station, the first thing I asked was, "Where's Thomas?" No one answered right away. That told me everything. Paul sat by my cot all that evening, his face gaunt, eyes bloodshot from lack of sleep. "I tried," he said softly. "I know. I did everything. I know." Paul bowed his head. Knowing doesn't make it hurt less. I turned away, stared at the tent canvas billowing in the wind. No. Knowing doesn't make it hurt less. In the days that followed, the tide of battle shifted. Germans fell back. Victory news came more often. Liberated towns. Roads once full of shells began showing people carrying water, sweeping yards, fixing doors. But it was in that phase, when light seemed to be returning, that I witnessed the most horrifying thing of the war. Our unit helped liberate a large camp in Germany. I won't describe everything I saw there. Some images, if spoken too precisely, make words feel too small. I will say only this. I saw human beings reduced to skeletons wrapped in skin, looking at us with eyes full of fear and disbelief. I saw rooms where human cruelty was more evident than any speech could convey. And I understood, deeply, painfully, absolutely, that some wars you cannot stand aside from. Paul stood speechless for a long time. Donnelly removed his helmet, without a word. Carter's jaw clenched so hard veins stood out on his neck. And I thought of Thomas, of Joey, of those who died at the bridge, of cold nights in the Ardennes, of Grace and Emily in Kansas. I understood that the price the American Army paid was not just to win positions on a map. It was to pull humanity back from an abyss that, without someone standing in the way, evil would have swallowed countless more lives. That night, I wrote another letter to Grace. Shorter, less roundabout. Dear Grace, today I saw the final, clearest reason for all this loss. There are evils that, if not stopped, would make the whole world evil forever. I remember what you said. Don't let war take your kindness. I think it's precisely because we still have kindness that we cannot turn away from cruelty. I paused upon a long time, then added, if Emily ever asks why the American Army had to fight, tell her that sometimes protecting people from darkness is also a form of love. I folded the letter. Outside the tent, night wind moved through rows of military vehicles. Someone was softly singing a hymn. No one told them to. Everyone understood. War can end in victory. But victory only matters when people still remember what they fought to save. Spring 1945 came late, or perhaps after so much death. Every season felt delayed. Victory news spread through the unit without movie-like explosions. Not everyone jumped for joy. Not everyone cheered. Some shouted happily. Some hugged quickly. Some knelt and wept. Some sat still, as if they couldn't yet believe they had lived to see this day. I stood in the muddy field after spring rain, helmet in hand, looking at the pale sky. Paul hugged me. "We made it, Daniel." I nodded, but in my head, only the faces appeared of those who never got to see this day. Joey, Martin, Chaplain O'Connor, Thomas. Carter walked the line, stopping before each man. He didn't smile, just said in a hoarse voice, "You completed your mission with honor." Honor, a simple word. But at that moment it felt heavier than any medal, because that honor was paid in blood, in youth, in names that no longer answered roll call. That evening, for the first time in forever, we had a hot meal. Someone found real coffee. Bread, too. Thomas should have been sitting to my right, grimacing at the bad coffee, and making up jokes about going home to be a dad. That empty space haunted me more than any nightmare. Paul pulled a small piece of cloth from his pocket. It was the blue ribbon Lucy once gave me. He said, "I sewed it inside Thomas's pocket the day we buried him." I looked up at Paul, eyes stinging. "Thank you." She represented what he saved. I bowed my head. Yes, Thomas didn't just save one child on the bridge. He saved the meaning of sacrifice. The days waiting for the ship home were strange. No morning gunfire. No rush deployments. No death lurking behind every tree line. But in its place was a vast emptiness, where it had occupied our bodies so long that when it left, we felt hollow. One evening, Carter called me outside. He stood alone by the wire fence. "Hayes, you're going home soon." "Yes, sir." "Are you afraid?" I was surprised. "Afraid to go home, sir?" He nodded. I thought a moment. Then honestly, yes. Carter looked far off. War teaches you how to survive, but it doesn't always teach you how to go back to normal. I swallowed. "Will you ever get back to normal, sir?" He gave a sad smile. "I don't think anyone comes back exactly the same. But a good soldier isn't one who pretends not to hurt. It's one who carries that hurt home and still chooses to live decently." I remember that sentence forever, because later it saved me through very hard years. Before boarding the ship, I sat alone and took Thomas's 3 letters from my pocket. One from Margaret, one for his son, one for me. I opened mine first. Inside only a few lines. "Daniel, if you're reading this, either I was unlucky or you're too curious for your own good. I hope it's the second. But if it's the first, listen. Don't let my death make you live less. Hold your daughter tight. Kiss your wife one extra time for my share. And if anyone asks you what the American Army is, tell them it's the place where a loudmouth like me found brothers worth dying for." I had to fold the letter. Couldn't read further. Wind blew hard on deck, but not as hard as the pain tearing my chest. America peered through morning mist like a dream I feared I no longer deserved to touch. The harbor was packed, flags waving, music playing, cheers rising. The soldiers around me laughed, cried, called names into the distance. I stepped off the gangway with shaking legs, like the first time I fired on the range. I saw Mother first. She cried and laughed at once. Father stood beside her, back still straight as the day I left, but eyes red. Then I saw Grace. She held a brown-haired little girl in her arms. Emily, my daughter. The child looked at me intently, clinging a little to her mother's shoulder, as if trying to understand why everyone was so emotional over this strange man in uniform. I slowed, suddenly afraid. Afraid I no longer belonged here. Afraid she wouldn't reach for me. Afraid war had come home on the ship with me, and now stood right behind my shoulder. Grace walked forward, said nothing, just touched my cheek as if to confirm I was real, then whispered, "You're home." I nodded, couldn't speak. She placed Emily in my arms. The child was impossibly light, warm, soft, alive. I looked down at her face, big eyes round, small mouth pursed. Tears came before I could stop them. "Hello, baby." I said hoarsely, "Daddy's here." Emily flailed her arms wildly, then suddenly grabbed my finger. Just one small movement, but it pulled me out of every explosion still stuck in my head. In that instant, I understood why American soldiers had endured so much to come home, not just to live, but to touch once more what they had fought to protect. The little house in Kansas was still there, the slightly creaky porch, mother's baking smell, chickens clucking, cupboard doors squeaking, everything familiar to the point of heartache. The first night in my own bed, in the dark, quiet room, I couldn't sleep again. The peace terrified me. No artillery, no changing of the guard, no one calling names in the night, only Grace's even breathing beside me. I lay rigid until she placed her hand on my chest. "You're home." I nodded faintly, but tears flowed in the dark. I was home, and I carried too many who never made a home. In the months that followed, I relearned how to live, how to hold a child, how to laugh without guilt, how to walk through a storm without ducking, how to hear a can drop in the kitchen without reaching for a rifle. It wasn't easy. Some nights, I dreamed of Thomas, saw him standing on a burning bridge, mud on his face, smiling and saying, "Keep going, Daniel." Grace never asked too much. She was just there, quiet, patient. Many survivors made it because of women like her. One afternoon, I told Grace I had to go to Tennessee. She knew why immediately. She didn't stop me, just took my heavy coat from the hook and handed it to me. "Bring Thomas home." Margaret Reed's house stood at the end of a dirt road, white rose bushes in front of the porch. I stood at the gate a long time. The uniform on my back suddenly felt heavy enough to drag me under. Margaret opened the door, still very young, younger than the pain in her eyes. When she saw me, saw the American uniform, saw the face of a man carrying news no one wants, she understood at once. Her hand on the doorknob went white. "I'm Daniel Hayes," I said softly, "Thomas's friend." Margaret nodded faintly, then stepped aside to let me in. Inside smelled of wood, clean laundry, and silence. On the table was a photo of Thomas, smiling brightly in civilian clothes. On the floor, a boy about 2 played with wooden blocks. Thomas's son. I had to turn away for a few seconds. Margaret invited me to sit, her voice very small. Did he suffer? No question in the world is harder to answer. I looked up at the woman, then told the truth, but in a way she could live with. He was scared, like anyone would be, but he was very brave. And at the end, he only talked about you and the boy. Margaret broke into tears, not loud crying, the kind of sound that cracks open from the deepest part of the heart, making the listener feel their own chest cracking too. I took the 3 letters out, placed them on the table. "Thomas asked me to keep these." She clutched the 2 for herself and her son to her chest, as if holding the last piece of Thomas. I didn't know what else to do but sit there. After a while, the boy toddled over, offered me a red block. I took it, swallowed hard. "What's his name?" "James," Margaret answered. I nodded. His father was very proud of him, even though he didn't get to see him much. Margaret looked at me through tears. What was he like outside the battlefield? I drew a deep breath, then told her. I told her Thomas carried a comrade through snow, shared the last piece of chocolate, played harmonica on Christmas in a ruined church, ran onto a burning bridge to save a child he didn't know, was loud, stubborn, talkative, and kinder than anyone wanted to admit. When I finished, Margaret wiped her eyes. So he lived exactly like himself. I nodded. Yes. She looked out the window where afternoon sun fell on white roses. Thank you, not just for bringing the letters, but for letting me know Thomas didn't die for nothing. I stood to leave. Before I reached the door, Margaret called, "Daniel." I turned. If one day my son asked who his father was, what should I tell him? I looked at little James stacking blocks clumsily on the floor, then answered, "Tell him his father was an American soldier who knew fear, knew homesickness, knew love for his family, and still chose to protect others to the end. Tell him his father didn't just wear the uniform. He made that uniform worth respecting." Margaret cried again, but this time her eyes held something else. Pride. The pain didn't disappear. It never fully does. But when placed beside the truth of courage, it becomes meaningful. Many think war ending means everything returns to normal. No, war ends, and the rest of life begins learning how to carry it. I went back to work in my father's farm. Emily grew. She loved running barefoot in the yard, collecting creek pebbles, sitting in my lap demanding the same story about the big train that brought Daddy home. I didn't tell her everything at first, never the full thing right away, just enough so she understood peace isn't something naturally given. It's a gift preserved by enormous sacrifice. Every year on December 24th, I place a small piece of chocolate on the windowsill. Grace understands, doesn't ask, just quietly sets a candle beside it. Every year, on the day Thomas died, I write a short letter to Margaret and James. Nothing fancy, just a few lines about the weather, the crops, how Emily learned to ride a bike, how I still remember Thomas's laugh. James grew up with those letters. When he was 18, he sent me a photo of himself in uniform. I held it with shaking hands and had to sit down. His letter read, Uncle Daniel, I didn't join the army to die like Dad. I joined to live in a way that honors how he lived. I read that line many times, then cried like a child. Some families are broken by war. Some are bound tighter by war. Through memory, honor, promises not to let the fallen vanish into forgetting. That, too, is part of the quality of the American Army I still respect. Bonds that outlast the fighting. Brotherhood that doesn't end when the guns stop. Surviving soldiers don't turn their backs on the families of the lost. They bring each other home in every way possible. Through letters, through memories, through standing together at funerals, weddings, the long post-war years. Carter served a few more years and retired. Paul became a doctor. Donnelly opened a farm machinery repair shop and still barked at anything that moved within 10 feet. We met again a few times at veterans gatherings. Each time, when Thomas's name came up, there was a moment of silence. No one avoided it, because mentioning the dead isn't to reopen wounds. It's to keep them alive in gratitude. Once, when Emily was about 12, she asked, Daddy, do you hate war? I looked at her. Her hair like Grace's, eyes like mine, the way she sat curled on the peaceful porch. I answered, yes. Then why are you still proud you were a soldier? I was quiet a long time, then said, because hating war doesn't mean you can't respect those who stood against cruelty. I'm proud of the American Army not because war is beautiful, but because in the ugliest parts of war, I saw the most decent men. Emily thought about it. Like Uncle Thomas? I smiled sadly. Yes, like Uncle Thomas. The tape recorder in front of me is still turning. Steady hiss. I pause to sip water. Outside, sunset spills pale gold across the front lawn. Caleb, my grandson, is probably playing somewhere with his new baseball. He's still too small to understand why Grandpa sometimes stands so long in front of the flag on the porch. But the time will come, and when it does, I want him to hear more than polished stories from podiums. I want him to hear the truth, that American soldiers also cry, also fear, also tremble opening letters from home, also have children they never got to hold, also call their mother's name before closing their eyes, but they still stood up, still covered their comrades, still saved children, still shared their last bite, still kept the oath to the flag on their shoulders. I leaned closer to the microphone. Caleb, if you're hearing this, remember one thing. Never glorify war, but bow your head to those who carried it so others wouldn't have to. I look at the old photo again. 4 young men, only one left. I respect the American Army not because it's invincible, not because it's perfect. I respect it because in the cruelest years, I saw its soldiers choose right even when right hurt more than anything. I touched Thomas's face in the photo. I saw a medic crawl under fire to save someone. A gruff sergeant break his last ration in half. A lieutenant stay calm so the unit wouldn't break. And a best friend run onto a burning bridge to carry a child he didn't know. I draw a deep breath. If that isn't enough to call noble, then I don't know what on earth is. I press stop. The cassette slows. Then silence. An hour later, I drive to the veterans' cemetery. Dusk is falling. Caleb sits beside me, unusually quiet, perhaps sensing this isn't an ordinary trip. We stop before rows of white headstones stretching straight into the distance. I step out, carrying a small bouquet. Caleb holds my hand. Grandpa, Who are we visiting? A friend of mine. We walk slowly through the lines. Finally stop at the stone that reads, Thomas E. Reed, U.S. Army. I kneel, place the flowers in a small chocolate bar in front of the grave. Caleb watches, surprised. Grandpa, white chocolate. I smile very softly, because he once shared his last half with me. Caleb thinks a moment, then squats down and places a blue marble from his pocket beside the chocolate. So he has something to play with, he says. I turn my face away, because if I don't, the boy will see my eyes red. Afternoon wind moves through the small flags planted by the graves. The fluttering sound is like a greeting. I stand at attention, raise my hand in one final salute to the friend who left 42 years ago. And in that moment, my heart no longer only hurts. It is also full of gratitude. Gratitude for standing in the same ranks as men like Thomas. Gratitude for witnessing the dignity of American soldiers in the darkest days. Gratitude that though war took so much, it could not take the most beautiful thing we kept for each other. I speak very softly, as if the wind can carry it. Thomas, I brought you home. Many years from now, people may forget the name of a battle, forget the position of a bridge, forget the exact number of a campaign. But stories like this should not be forgotten, because history is not written only in maps and orders. It is written with the hand of an American soldier resting on a trembling child's shoulder, with a piece of chocolate broken in half on a starving, freezing night, with a comrade's name shouted through gunfire, with a letter kept whole from battlefield to hometown, with the promise of men who knew they might not survive, yet stepped forward anyway. And perhaps that is what is most worth praising. Not war, but humanity still standing tall inside war. Not the sound of guns, but hearts that refuse to let guns turn them cruel. Not destruction, but the strength to protect. If I had to say briefly what the American Army is in this story, the answer would be men who know pain, no longing, no fear, no love, but when needed, they still stand. To preserve freedom, shield comrades, shelter the innocent, and carry the honor of their flag to the very last breath. And as long as someone keeps telling these stories, those who fell will never truly be gone.